This reality becomes so much more magnified with the rise of AI, because now the ability to a much deeper level understand your business is there.
Caroline and Tadeu Souza are co-founders of optometry software company EyePegasus. In this conversation, you're going to love the conversation about how we bring insight to how software technology and specifically embedded AI capabilities can be actually leveraged to develop a sharper bottom line to your practice. Go ahead and take a listen. This is the Think Again podcast. I'd like to kick off our conversation by talking about how I think many ODs think about their internal technology software systems. I'm wondering, Tadeu, if you can agree or disagree with the thought I have that too many practices look at their software as a utility as opposed to a business information system. How do you land on that?
Yes, I couldn't agree more. In fact, it's part of what we try to portray as well. So the utility part of it, it's almost like a given, taken for granted. You should expect your EHR and practice management system to allow you to capture the information that is vital for your day-to-day workflow. However, we truly believe it should be way beyond that. It should be the means by which you make informed decisions. In other words, the data that is being captured in both the EHR and practice management system can allow you to truly know the health of your business, areas for improvements, how you can maximize your revenues, and also patient care. So, yes, I couldn't agree more with that statement.
I mean, you're going to talk us more through this in a moment, but let me follow up by asking, isn't it the original idea of the EHR part that patient care would get better than it was through paper records? And even that is something that doctors have to really work at. In other words, it doesn't just all pop back up at you. You have to use the EHR as a tool.
Yes, well, it's starting from the obvious, right? The paper workflow just isn't sufficient. Too many times, staff are looking for paper charts for patients that are here. Hey, I'm here to see you, but you can't even find my records. So that's just taken for granted. In an electronic system, you'll find the patient's chart immediately. So now, yes, there are particular ways in which doctors should be mindful on how to use the technology, capturing the proper data points, which would give them not only a more comprehensive data set with which to care for the patient, but again, to go back to our original point, to run some analytics and say, hey, which treatment plans are working better than others, and so on. So there are, to your point, yes, it is wise to keep in mind that using the technology in a proper way is crucial.
So, to my audience now, Tadu is going to help us understand how technology can actually help us develop a sharper bottom line. So, ODs think about the retail side, upselling or pushing more patients through the funnel. But why don't you tell us a little bit about how you believe a practitioner should properly use the software? Let's talk about examples of how an OD business owner can drive profitability. How does this start? How does this process of using it and doing analytics begin?
By data entry. And so we want to make sure that the specific fields that are meant to capture particular data are being used accordingly. So, in other words, if there is a field there for patient's phone number, we should not enter the patient's last name in there, right? So, the reason why is because when we are running analytics, we are depending on these data points for various data processing techniques, such as filtering, averaging, the sum of certain things. And so to be mindful that the way in which we are entering data matters, and to almost have the mentality that this is a piece of the system, but the system itself exists, which is made out of interconnected parts. And so they all should be talking to each other properly. So it does matter how each staff member is entering data for the greater whole of the system, it matters and it should be cohesive. Otherwise, the value that we are looking for, especially when it comes down to analytics, won't be realized. So it starts by proper data entry.
So that completely makes sense. Now, I know some systems, to your example, it's a bit of a joke, right? Because sometimes numeric fields don't allow text entry, but you're telling us that we should be thinking about pre-configuring and setting internal rules for the fields that we're ultimately going to use later to do deep data analysis. And that is really important because that configuration that obviously becomes before the users enter. How do you advise people to properly think about what fields are going to be the most important or which fields should configure to eventually be the ones that are data analyzed?
To be really mindful and ready to ask good questions during the implementation process, because that's the time where we're doing the gap analysis and we are trying to understand from the practice point of view what is it that they're trying to achieve for their specific needs. And then our team is then capable to translate your needs into practical actions that are to be taken inside of the system. So that's the time to ask good questions, such as, in our practice, for us, it is really important that, and then you can fill out the blank so that we are aware of what is valuable for you. So then we can guide you properly. Okay, therefore, you should pay extra attention here, whether it's the claims module, the invoice module, scheduling, or the EHR, etc. So then that implementation process is quite important because that's the time where the experts that have built the system will touch base with your practice and then mirror your workflows that perhaps are already in place and which may slightly be modified to then allow you to enter the proper data and proper information to then have access to what you need. Does that make sense?
It does. So now let's take that all as the starting point and say people have been doing this work, they've been entering data the right way. I know that you have some business intelligent insights that you even maybe use large language model or AI around some of these data fields to start focusing the doctor to figuring out where they can enhance their business. Can you give us some examples of searches or sorts, the types of data that are analyzed that once you analyze them, tell you better about how to refine and reform your practice?
Yes, absolutely. I'm super excited to talk about this. And so much so that I'm going to take a few step backs to paint, hopefully, a very comprehensive picture.
Okay.
So we know that doctors like yourself, you guys are extraordinary in the exam room. You have a tremendous amount of knowledge and capabilities to care for the patient. And hence, you guys are doctors. But it is common knowledge to our industry that at times it can feel overburdened, that not only you have to care for the patients, but also handle a whole retail cell operation, an optical, and there's the whole side of the business of optometry, which it seems, according to the common knowledge in the industry, that it has been a little bit neglected during schooling years, that the business management of running a retail operation wasn't really emphasized during formal training in the school years. And yet, it is something that is inevitably inherited. You have not only patients, but a full retail operation to run right now. And so, having said that, then there is the benefits that traditional digital systems could help. Example, what we were being discussing so far. If you now have a good set of information and data, you are able to run some analytics and discover some room for improvements, or perhaps areas in which you're doing really well and you want to replicate that across other departments. And so, without the EHR and practice management system as a tool, far beyond just an utility system or a store of records, let's say. Far beyond that, if we are entering data properly, if we have even the expectations that this system should be giving me the means by which I can run my business, both retail and clinical, much, much better, the whole approach, the whole mindset about the system will already naturally change. And so I would say that was true a decade ago. A decade ago, maybe even 2 decades ago, the digital systems were there, starting to pop up and providing this value. Whether or not most users have realized this value, that's a different story, but they're already there. Now, starting today, or perhaps even a year to 2 years max ago, this reality becomes so much more magnified with the rise of AI. Because now the ability to a much deeper level understand your business is there, much so that much more than before, when what you had was perhaps a tabular report maybe 20 years ago, then evolving a little bit more, maybe some dashboards where now we are having some graphs, some bar charts, etc., some pie charts that is giving you more information rather than just data that you then have to make sense out of. You can now easier visualize what the data suggests by simply looking at graphs, more visual representation of your data. However, with AI now, even that may not be necessary because the AI, let's say an AI consultant, a virtual AI consultant, can itself understand the data, understand what the visual representation of that data suggests, but even more, to really start using the full capability of AI to start discovering really intricate areas of your business that you wouldn't otherwise see, and for various reasons. Perhaps, like we were discussing earlier, you are super busy with patient care. And maybe you are looking at something, but don't necessarily understand what to do with that, especially if it's a tabular report. Uh, but even if it's graphical, okay, I'm looking at some KPIs, bar charts here, but what does that all mean? And perhaps even more important, do I have time to sit here and try to infer viable information from these graphs? And that's a challenge. But with AI now, it is able itself to not only proactively identify room for improvements and alert you in a way that it doesn't need any guesswork, in a way that is backed by data, is a rather empirical approach. It can be replicated, right? It's very, very scientific, and just tell you like exactly what it is that you need to do, areas that you need to pay attention to, or even congratulate you and say, hey, you are above the 96th percentile of this particular category. So make sure that you replicate that. If you hire a new optician and your optical capture rate is outstanding already, make sure that that optician is really shuttering the existing opticians because they have already driven that particular KPI to a very high percentile. So then it can also help you to replicate areas in which you're doing well. Does that make sense so far?
It does.
Yeah, if I may add to that too, I think like Tadeu just mentioned earlier, doctors are really trained on being a doctor, and so looking at those reports and making sense out of it, and even if you enter your data perfectly, right, to just look at that analysis and then get into that mode of paralysis by analysis, just too much. But if we have a tool, and which AI, we now have that tool to pre-digest that information for you and to present it to you in a way that you can even maybe get like an email digest or something where you just read, okay, this is how my practice is doing, and here's some recommendations on how you can improve. You all of a sudden have a tool in your hand that you can take action on. Like you don't have to go back. Maybe you still want to hire a consultant to execute some of those functions, but the AI consultant can shed some light of area of improvement without having you to dive into hours of analysis and trying to figure it out yourself. So that's where the potential comes in.
And yeah,
Oh, go ahead, please.
yeah, man, back to the concept of the human consultants, right? So there's always room, and there will always be room for that, of course, to set in motion many of the execution of it. The human piece of it remains really, really important and necessary. However, with the AI, there are things that the AI consultants can identify proactively, perhaps even better than a human. And I'll give you an instance. So, for example, let's say that there is a average sales, average optical sales. It's now down, but very slightly, very tiny, like a 1 to 2%. It's going to take some time before that starts to show up in a trend line, and maybe you're looking at like a quarterly trend or like a monthly trend, and then you identify, oh hey, it's been 2 months now we were going down. So that would be a very natural human like approach before this tiny gap starts to present itself in a trend line. The AI becomes really powerful here, and I'll get into a T-tier example here now. Either AI can proactively access and analyze and realize that and alert you before 2 months has passed or like a quarter has passed, because now we are looking retroactively in the past and saying, hey, it's been already 2 months that we've been losing revenues here. So not only it prevents that when appropriate, but even if we are really leveraging its knowledge, its capability, and that's part of why we get so excited, because having worked with it now for like a year, in like an in-depth scenario, we are really realizing all of its capabilities. The intricate part could also be in the example that I just gave, that, hey, but at what point do we have to consider micromanaging and giving enough room for inevitable like margin of error that is inevitable to take place? Maybe a family of five walked in, and maybe one of the family members' glasses didn't turn out to be good, and there were some conflicts, whatever. So then they cancel everybody's orders. Well, that's going to put a dent on that day's production, no doubt about it. And is that something that we should be hyper alert about? It's not. There's just natural. Something like that will happen. It will not show up in a trend. So AI can also detect that and really only alert you if it is indeed something that is concerning, that you don't have to wait a month, a week even. No, this is very unusual, and it is not due to some of this expected margin of errors or micromanaging issues. It can account into that and really proactively alert you about some trend that you would otherwise only realize a month, maybe even a quarter later. So just that already saving you some lost revenues.
So another example that I think about as I hear you speaking about this would be, does AI have the ability to do things that might be around the schedule, looking at whether or not your booking percentage has gone down? Is that also another way it could be used? And it's just one, but is that an example? Or frame board management? Does it tell you that you're keeping more inventory on hand than you have in the past? Are those other examples of how it can help?
Absolutely. So there are two main distinct areas of AI. One is generative AI. So this is the concept of LLM, large language models. So they are generating something new, something that didn't exist, with a tremendous amount of knowledge and information, but essentially creating something new. Now, there is also predictive AI. And predictive AI now, we are relying on data of the past, analyzing trends, and therefore predicting the future. And so absolutely, especially the use case you just mentioned, is something that we are working with as well, to predict patients' no-show. So for example, we found that there are about 3 or 4 variables that are the highest indicators of whether or not the patient will not show. For example, day of the week, if it's a Friday night, whether Wednesday, midday, or distance from the practice. Do I live 1 mile, 5 miles away? And the most important variable was book lag. In other words, how long ago did the patient schedule the appointment? The sooner, the shortest the gap has been, the more likely the patient is to show. But if the patient scheduled the appointment like 3 weeks ago or a month ago, they're more likely they are not to show. So to answer your question, yes, there are some variables that are really revealing. And when we train a predictive AI model to understand these patterns, then at the moment that an appointment is scheduled, we can assign a probability of no show and then react to that in a very educated way. So for example, if the patient is 80% or higher likely to not show, then maybe we can move this patient to like a secondary lane and open up the primary lane for that comprehensive exam that is revenue generating to be available. And then focus our scheduling team to make sure you fulfill those appointments, or just set up a more aggressive appointment reminder profile for those patients that meet a particular threshold. So yeah, and then inventory, predicting how many frames, what color, depending on the time of the year, because it will be very unique to your specific data, your specific demographics, your specific zone of the country, time of the year, etc. And it can very accurately predict what your inventory should be like.
Does the EHR side of the platform benefit the same way from any of these predictive AI models, or is that different? In other words, does it help you identify patients at risk or patients that maybe are sliding in a way you don't want them to, or is it not to that point yet?
It is. It requires more data in that area. In other words, treatment plans, which ones were more effective. So then it requires naturally for you to see the patient over a period of time and have done so with many patients. So then now we have data that is spanning across, maybe 3-4 years, so that we can track the progress of the disease and which treatments were more successful versus others. So then now we are talking about a time frame of 3 to 4 years and a data sample of about maybe in the thousands, because the more data, the better. And so thousands of diseases that were trained, same diseases, but treated in different ways, of people of the same characteristics, male, female, age, etc. And then see the progression, who got better, who didn't, the rate in which you got better. And then you compile all the data and create a predictive AI model that can say, hey, according to statistics, this patient, this age, this gender, this condition, having lasted for this long, given the fact that these drugs the patient is already taking or not, etc., take all those variables into consideration and predict the best possible treatment plan. So that is possible, and but it does require a lot of data, a lot of good quality data to achieve that.
Because we need to train the AI model to be able to accomplish those tasks. Together with other data that might already exist in the industry that we can leverage, but that model needs to be trained to be able to make accurate predictions, because that's something we can't play with, right? So that needs to be accurate.
Yeah, that's something that we've taken quite seriously. We wanted to discern the hype from the fiction. And so AI is extremely exciting. It's what we've been doing. It's our priority number one for the past year right now. And it's really, really, really exciting. But we are not willing to compromise accuracy for the hype. And so taking that conservative approach that, yes, we're living in the very cutting edge of technology, but we're talking about healthcare. So we're talking about patients' eyesight. And so we do not want to compromise quality and accuracy for the hype. And so, yes, it is very much possible, but it does require a large data set that is of good quality so that we can achieve predictability percentages that is at least as good as humans, right? Because otherwise we are going to be taking a turn downwards, which is not acceptable.
Well, the long play is where it's at. And I'm really grateful that you are thinking about that as an industry vendor. So I'll finish with this. Give us a little bit of insight. I know your system is invoking a number of these tools. Not all systems are. How does one of the audience members that's listening to this think about their next 5 years? Are they going to need to start looking at tools and systems, whether it's embedded like yours or something that's external? What is the advice you give, the closing advice you give to the people that have listened so far on how to get engaged with these tools?
To, first of all, understand them. There is a difference between what they are capable of doing better than us versus things that they are not doing better than us. So to really understand the tools so that we don't have to blindly fear them. And if we are able to arrive at that platform where we truly understand, then we will know that AI is not here to replace anybody, but rather it is here to empower everybody. No one needs to be replaced by it. Everybody can be empowered by it. However, it is true at the same time that I really believe, being a technologist, that AI will not replace humans, but humans that are using AI will most certainly replace humans that are not using AI. And so I would say that to get familiar with these tools so that we understand them and learn how to leverage them is crucial, because they are amazing now and they're only going to get better. And then the distance between a person who may not be using AI versus a person who is using AI, or a corporation who is using AI. So retail chains, uh, many different competitors that are using at a enterprise corporation level. It would be very tough to compete against an entire corporation of thousands of people, all armed with the power of AI, while the independent optometrist who is trying to compete against that, who is not using AI, the gap will be too long, it will be too big. And so my main recommendation is to learn them, learn how to leverage these tools, become empowered by them, don't fear them, and integrate them more so now than ever, so that you can remain competitive and empower not only yourself, but everybody on your staff. Each and every staff member can be empowered by a different AI aspect. And then in that way, your entire practice will gain from it.
That's excellent advice. Karoline and Tadeu Souza, thank you so much for being my guests today on this Think Again podcast.
Thank you for having us. We've been looking forward to this for a long time, and it was very exciting.
It's been fun. Thank you.
And to the audience, that's it for today's Think Again podcast, brought to you by GPN Visions, a peer-to-peer learning community to help grow your eye care business.